you teased us a little bit in your tweets and Facebook posts this week, a little bit about what you're planning on sharing with us based on your new book. So why don't you get started with what you'd have to share with us tonight?
Yeah, well, thanks everybody for joining us. And if you're joining us this evening looking for sensible, strategic, tried and true tips on how to find belonging, I'm so glad you're here, but also prepared to be wildly disappointed. The source of your disappointment will, I think, be twofold. First of all, I'll be speaking largely from my own experience this evening, and I'm not exactly the poster child for fitting neatly into the world. For example, I grew up so confused about my national identity that I once told my parents I thought airports were, and I quote, super homey because at least they're the same in every country. During one season of my childhood, when I was particularly insecure about my United States citizenship, I allowed myself to be photographed wearing a Statue of Liberty t-shirt, knee-high blue and white striped socks, and red and white spangled shorts. Yes. Needless to say, I've since repented of this, but repentance does not save us from the consequences of our poor choices. I'm gay and celibate, and I love Jesus in a world that fears all three of those things. So most of the tried and true tips I can offer you from my personal experience are just tried and true tips about how to be a particularly idiosyncratic brand of misfit. But here's the second and more significant reason that those of you looking for sensible and strategic belonging advice will be disappointed tonight. Because I want to talk to you about what it means to belong the way Jesus belonged. And Jesus, you may be chagrined to hear, was also not exactly a poster child for fitting neatly into the world. The road to belonging the way Jesus belonged is not a road paved with sensible strategic advice. Quite the opposite. In Matthew chapter 8, when a well-meaning would-be disciple says to Jesus, "I'll follow you anywhere," Jesus fends the man off with these words, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." In other words, Jesus says, if you want to pour out your life in pursuit of me, great, delightful, prepare for a lifetime of vagrancy. It's a pretty disheartening recruitment speech. Matthew never goes on to tell us how the would-be disciple responds to Jesus, but the prospects seem grim. What's the point of following a leader whose signature promise is that you'll be permanently out of place? Later on in the Gospel of Matthew, Peter asks Jesus this very question. "We've left everything to follow you," Peter says. "What then will there be for us?" And Jesus replies, "Everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life." Jesus has a plan for Peter and for all his disciples to find belonging far better than anything they've dared to dream. But the way to get to that belonging is illogical and counterintuitive. It is, to borrow the Apostle Paul's term in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, foolishness. You want houses, says Jesus? Leave them. You want family? Better lose that too. You want life abundant, places in which you belong and people with whom you belong and purposes to which you belong? Good. Then stop clinging so hard to those things. In pursuit of Jesus, everything must be lost so that everything can be found. Everything must be made homeless so that everything can finally be made to belong. So this evening, instead of offering you Greg's 10 simple steps to foolproof belonging, money back guaranteed, I want to propose instead 3 how-tos that I actually know a little something about. Number 1, how to lose a country. Number 2, how to lose a family. And number 3, how to lose yourself. If you're not pleased with this particular selection of how-tos, your money back is guaranteed, but please keep in mind that the webinar was free. Because my thesis tonight Insofar as a meandering medley of stories and reflections, shamelessly self-plagiarized from a forthcoming book, can be said to have a thesis, my thesis is this. If you want to find belonging as a follower of Jesus, the best skill you can acquire is the fine art of losing everything. So then, how-to number 1, how to lose a country. My parents gave me a distinct advantage in the country losing department by moving my family from the United States to Indonesia when I was 3 years old. As a result, I grew up with the sense that every nation I called home was actually someone else's home much more than it was mine. Indonesia belonged to its citizens first and foremost, I figured, and to me only in a partial and secondary way. As for the US, I was barely more than a glorified tourist, no matter what my birth certificate said. In the neighborhood where I grew up, in Bandung, Indonesia, there was a wall with an Independence Day mural painted onto it that I would walk past every day on my way to school. The mural showed a uniformed Dutch colonizer holding a gun, being stabbed through the stomach by a shirtless Indonesian guy with a bamboo pole. 17 Agustus, happy Indonesian Independence Day. And that mural served as a fitting representation of my inner life. I was somehow both the Dutch soldier and the Indonesian patriot, both the tall white outsider and the one who had lived his 15 most formative years on Indonesian soil. This national confusion gave me some serious national anthem issues, kind of like some people have daddy issues. When I would sing the Star Spangled Banner, I had no idea what ramparts were. And so I assumed that it was 2 words, ramparts, because I saw those quite a bit in Indonesia. I wasn't particularly sure why the Americans were watching the ramparts or why they had decided to fly a flag directly overhead. But I figured maybe it's like a nationalistic animal sacrifice situation, or maybe they're just hungry. Then there was the Indonesian national anthem, which begins, Indonesia tanah airku, tanah tumpah darahku, which translates to Indonesia, my land and water, land where my blood has been shed. And every time I would sing it, I would wonder whether the words applied to me. Was Indonesia mine? Did skinning my knees and bleeding onto the dirt and asphalt qualify me as someone whose blood had been shed on Indonesian land? Could I be part of that nation and belong in it while still admitting that I didn't wear the weight of its history or own a stake in its future? The reality is, I fit in Indonesia and the United States as much as I'll ever fit anywhere short of eternity. There's only one nation I'm pledging total allegiance to, and it isn't on a world map. I've got nations I'm glad to call mine for the time being, but I'll always be a bit nationless as well. I want to propose to you this evening that nationlessness isn't something that belongs only to me or to people like me. I think nationlessness is also for those of us who grieve and repent of the ways our countries of origin have been guilty and often continue to be guilty of dehumanization and enslavement and mistreatment and murder. Nationlessness is for those of us who look at the political divide around us and realize that no political party in any nation mirrors the interests of the kingdom of heaven. Nationlessness is for people who recognize that America first, and Australia first, and Afghanistan first, and Argentina first are all just different A-flavored brands of national idolatry. If you want to belong the way Jesus belonged, nationlessness isn't the whole story, but it's a necessary part of the journey. Consider what we're told about the faith of a guy named Abraham in Hebrews 11. By faith, Abraham made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Abraham's faith is exemplary precisely because he's still a stranger at the end of the story. Even the land he's buried on has to be bought specifically for that purpose. because no piece of the promised land belongs to him. Instead of taking him all the way home, Abraham's faith takes him only as far as the promise of home. And this apparently is the point of the story. As the author of Hebrews writes, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. They were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, and he has prepared a city for them. If Abraham hadn't still been longing for something at the end of the story, he wouldn't have been living by faith anymore. The longing, the waiting, the uncertainties and tense and promises, these were the things that marked him as an alien. And God, whose kingdom has no immigration bans and no extradition treaties, is eager to make homeless aliens into citizens. You and I are cordially invited to share this same citizenship, but we'll never be ready to receive it until we finally let go of the earthly citizenship we thought we needed and embrace the calling to be aliens. One loss down, 2 losses to go. So then, how-to number 2, how to lose a family. Now, this might be TMI, but I am not in the physiological sense of the word a eunuch. And yet, based on the amount of sex I'm currently having and the number of biological offspring I expect to leave behind when I die, the distinction between me and a eunuch sometimes feels negligible. I am, as far as I can tell, precisely the kind of person Jesus has in view when he says in Matthew 19, there are eunuchs who were born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. I seem to fit that third category rather well, the people who live a sexless and childless life, not because they have no other options, but because they truly believe that the kingdom of heaven is worth every ounce of their devotion. For people of Jesus' day, one of the great tragedies of a eunuch's life was that he would never have the opportunity to become a biological parent. His bloodline would end the day he died, leaving no one behind to carry on his legacy or to prove that his time on earth had mattered. Unmarried women of that era faced the same fear. So did every married couple unable to conceive children together for any reason. To be without offspring was to go unremembered. So maybe it's fitting that Jesus' next act in Matthew 19, just after describing people who, like Jesus himself, live as eunuchs by choice, is to place his hands on and pray for the little children who are brought to him. Jesus doesn't withdraw from the lives of children simply because he's not the one parenting them. On the contrary, Jesus declares children central to the kingdom of heaven. He invests in them, takes them seriously, invites them to follow in his footsteps of passionate love for God and neighbor. For Jesus' disciples, biological parenting isn't meant to be the only way we leave a legacy or build a family. It's not even meant to be the primary way we leave a legacy or build a family. Jesus treats the family of God as something much more substantial than just a pretty metaphor. It is a concrete claim, a literal state of being. Those who follow God together are family to one another. To be clear, I'm not saying that those of us who remain single or those couples unable to conceive biological kids can't still become parents. On the contrary, fostering and adoption are beautiful and necessary modes of parenting that are open to all of us, even the celibates. My point is, instead, that every follower of Jesus is called to leave a legacy, to take part in the family of God, to participate in the lives of those younger than us, regardless of whether we ever become parents in a biological or legal sense. If this family of God sounds like a cheap substitute for the traditional nuclear family we could have had, then maybe it's because we in the church have failed to really live like family to one another. When I think of the family God provides, I think of Grant and Max Henning. They're 14 and 10 years old now, but when I met them, they were 6 and 3. Here's the kind of children Grant and Max are. Once, we were all eating blizzards at Dairy Queen when I mentioned to them that I had recently learned the scientific name for an ice cream headache, sphenopalatine ganglioneuralgia. Grant, who was 9 at the time, set down his spoon and pulled a pen out of his pocket because obviously he traveled with pens in his pocket. And he said, "What was that again? Can you spell it for me?" So he scrawled the words on a napkin and spent the rest of the evening practicing them. And the following Sunday at church, when I asked 5-year-old Max how his morning was going, he triumphantly told me, "Pretty good, because I don't have sphenopalatine ganglioneuralgia." These are my kind of children. One evening when I was over at their house, Grant informed me, "Max and I can't decide if you're more like a brother or a weird uncle." And Max chimed in, "Yeah, Uncle Greg doesn't sound quite right, but you'd be a really older brother." Whatever the nature of my relationship is with Max and Grant, I don't have a name for it either. All I know is that the part of my heart they've taken up residence in is a part I didn't know existed before I met them. I've watched them grow taller across 7 years of hugs, from the days when Max's arms still wrapped around my legs to the moment when Grant's tousled hair could tickle the underside of my chin. I've watched them lose teeth and regain teeth, witness their first pairs of glasses, and affix their ever-changing school pictures to my fridge door with magnets. I've watched their personalities mature, seen them become more thoroughly themselves. And every once in a while, by some outrageous unearned privilege, I've seen traces of evidence that my brother-uncle presence in their lives has mattered. Grant has been known to lecture people on the pluralization of neuter nouns in ancient Greek, explaining why the preferred plural of the English word phenomenon is phenomena rather than phenomenons. When people tell me I'm weird, Grant tells me, I take that as a compliment. Our mutual friends will sometimes come to me shaking their heads after a conversation with Grant and murmur, "It's obvious the two of you hang out a lot." Max can tell you the difference between sanguine, meaning cheerfully optimistic, and sanguinary, meaning bloodthirsty. And he knows about the ancient medical theory of the 4 humors that cause these 2 words to share a common root. For a period of several months, I would greet Max by asking him whether he was feeling more sanguine or sanguinary that day. "Sanguinary," he would declare, and then lunge at me with bared teeth and pretend to bite my arm. Their mom once asked them, "Do you remember a time before we knew Greg?" Grant squinted hard and said, "A little bit, but not really." Max shook his head definitively. "I don't," he said. "Greg's always been part of the family." There's no way of knowing for certain what our friendship will look like in future years. Maybe as the boys grow into teenagerhood and adulthood, they'll stop calling me Crookshanks. And maybe they'll grow tired of hearing me call them Gruzelnut and Swilmac. But every minute I spend with them, every fond hug and fist bump, feels like proof that Jesus told the truth. Proof that the unearned and undeserved family God gives his disciples can still be better than any other family we might have tried to eke out for ourselves. And this brings us to how-to number 3, how to lose yourself. Let me tell you about the day I was supposed to die. It was the summer of 2006, and my friend Zach and I had planned a trip to our favorite coastal town, Pangandaran. It would be the quintessential summer getaway, days spent on the beach, racing across scalding sand and throwing ourselves into the merciful coolness of the waves, boogie boarding and body surfing for hours. Nights eating fresh-caught shrimp and pungent durian on the side of the street, walking barefoot along still warm but no longer scalding sand as gentle tides lapped our feet. This is the kind of thing you can do when you're a teenager living on an island in the tropics. I don't blame you for being a teensy bit jealous. A few days before our trip was scheduled to begin, Zach came down with a high fever. It was probably dengue or maybe chikungunya, though not such a severe case he needed to be diagnosed or hospitalized. Either way, the treatment was the same. Lots of fluids, lots of rest, and absolutely no adventuring to Pangandaran. So we canceled our trip. That's the only reason we weren't out in the waves when the tsunami hit. At its highest point, the wall of water reached over 20 meters, roughly as tall as a 7-story building. 668 people were killed by the impact or swept away to drown at sea. Houses and shop fronts were reduced to rubble, crushing their inhabitants. Chunks of wood and concrete torn away by the rushing water became weapons further inland. In the alternate universe, where Zach never got sick, that death toll rises from 668 to 670. The scene plays out in the same way in my head every time. The distant offshore earthquake, so faint we don't even feel it amid the crashing waves. The frantic shouts of our fellow swimmers, fingers outstretched toward the mammoth wave forming on the horizon. Swimming like we've never swum before, racing inland, buoyed forward and then pulled backward by the current. When the tsunami catches us, we turn invisible inside it, tumbling through sand and salt foam, losing all sense of up and down. There are plenty of people to whom this story belongs, much more than it belongs to me. There are eyewitness accounts of the Pangandaran tsunami from survivors whose brush with death was immediate and palpable. I was 200 kilometers away at the time, nowhere close to danger. And yet, the alternate universe where Zach never got sick has always felt only a hair's breadth away from reality. It's one thing to say abstractly that you've been spared from death. It's quite another thing to feel it concretely, to watch news footage of the devastation you accidentally missed, to visit the scene months later and still see piles of rubble and walls stained with water damage. When I looked out at the Pangandaran waterline, I saw the death I should have had. My waterlogged body floating at sea, eyes open but unseeing. I felt myself peel away from my own corpse like a ghost. In that moment of terrifying clarity, I told God that I wanted to live like I wasn't owed anything anymore. I wanted to live like someone whose life had stopped belonging to me. I wanted to live as if I had already died. It would have been nice if this ghostly rebirth of mine had come with a new gossamer body. Maybe my change of heart would have stuck a bit better if I could have seen it in the mirror. As it was, I still looked and felt so ordinary. More often than not, I still acted in ordinary ways. But every once in a while, when I found myself getting angry at God for depriving me of some happiness I believed I deserved, I would flash back to the scene of my death, and I would remember that I had already relinquished the right to live a life ordered toward my own happiness. It's harder to be angry with God when you stop believing God owes you something. Maybe this is why our new life in Christ is marked by baptism. Because if we want to truly live, we first need to face our death. We need to feel it, to sink beneath the waves in symbolic burial. Our old dreams and expectations and demands need to slip from our fingers and drift down to a watery grave. We need to emerge empty-handed, grasping nothing, dripping grace. You have died, the Apostle Paul tells a bunch of still very much biologically alive people in Colossians chapter 3. And your life is now hidden in Christ with God. The fact of our Christian death matters supremely. Not because we remain dead, but because life before death and life after death are fundamentally at odds with each other. Our new life is no longer ours at all. It is hidden, placed outside of us, beyond our control, insulated from every attempt to enhance or diminish it. There's nothing we can do to add to it anymore. No sense chasing the good life for ourselves. And there's nothing left to fear either, because the hidden life can't be taken away from us. Death has no power to kill a resurrected ghost. One of the great dangers of 21st century Western evangelical Christianity, I fear, is that too many of us have grown accustomed to resurrection without death. Our faith has room for empty crosses, but not for occupied ones. We quote Jeremiah 29:11 out of context, not by accident, but quite on purpose, because we prefer the idea of a religion in which all God's plans are made for us, to prosper us, to shield us from harm, to give us a hope and a future. We decide in advance what constitutes a good life, and then hire God on as a divine contractor at a negotiable hourly rate to help us achieve our goals. We call them God's plan, sure, but they're ours in their inception and direction, and His only in the sense that we've attributed them to Him. I know people who are so sure God will bless them with a spouse and 2 1/4 well-groomed children in perfect physical and mental health. So sure that God has the perfect job lined up for them, neither too challenging nor too boring, complete with dental benefits and a nice retirement package. So sure that God wants to prosper their nation, protect their family, polish their reputation, preserve their friendships, stock their pantry, and help them find their lost car keys. It's possible that God does indeed desire to give all these things, at least to some of us, some of the time. But if these are our aims, our religion is merely a self-centered enterprise, a means to the same good life we would have been chasing anyway. If we don't want the Jesus who might call us to celibacy or childlessness or heartbreak or ignominy, we don't want Jesus. If we don't want the Jesus who might eject us from a perfect job and an idyllic neighborhood so we can serve an unfamiliar community and die young of a mysterious tropical illness, we don't want Jesus. If we don't want the Jesus whose standard of love and hospitality and generosity toward those in need is so impractical and profligate that it might leave us mistreated and penniless, we don't want Jesus. Jesus wants to bless us, yes, but He wants to bless us the upside down way, with the kind of blessing that counterintuitively emerges by way of utter ruination. We find our lives only after first losing them, and not a moment sooner. There are no shortcuts to Christian death, as Johanna Finnegan so rightly said in her keynote address at the 2019 Revoice conference. You can't tell God, hey, since you're going to be giving me my life back anyway, how about I just hang on to it and we'll call it even? If all we want from Jesus is the glittering accessories of resurrection, with none of that pesky death along the way, we might have confused Jesus with Walmart. Jesus doesn't offer resurrection without death. Death is resurrection's only point of entry. This is where our Christian belonging begins, friends. With the loss of self, the loss of family, the loss of nation, the loss of everything we believed we so desperately needed in order to be happy. But loss is not where Christian belonging ends. The losses we accrue in pursuit of Jesus are simply a prelude to the far more glorious gains for which we've been designed. I'll never totally belong, and neither will you. Not on this side of eternity. But the gifts we receive as we follow Jesus like vagrants are still 100 times better than everything we could have possibly earned. At least that's what Jesus has promised us. And it's a promise that has proven true in my life again and again, no matter how many times I keep on doubting it. And I have a hunch, if you're willing to take the leap into Jesus, that promise will prove true for you as well. So let's talk about it.
Let's do that. Thank you so much, Greg. It's always interesting to think about those near-death or contemplating death experiences that really do cause us to reevaluate perspective and whatever it is that we're going to be looking at, that sometimes it's not so drastic and dramatic. Like that is a powerful, obvious, near death, force you to contemplate the meaning of life kind of event. But we all kind of have moments like that. Sometimes on an everyday basis. It could be something as simple as I was supposed to be at this place and there was a wreck there, or you hear stories of people who should have been at work on 9/11, but for whatever reason, they missed their train, or, stories of this is a place that I should have been and I wasn't. Do you think that there is, I don't want to say right, because it's not a right or a wrong, but a proper or helpful way to really contemplate our own mortality in a way that is beneficial for not only ourselves personally, for mental and emotional health, but also for how it is that we kind of find our place in the kingdom of God?
Yeah. Two things come to mind. The first is that I like to think of my life as being more of a loan than something that is actually mine and mine to keep. Yeah. That this is something that has been entrusted to me for a period of time. And kind of like the parable of the talents, people who are entrusted with something and God then comes back and they give an account of what they've done. I think life itself is the sort of thing that we have been entrusted, and we then have the opportunity to decide how we want to steward it for as long as we get to steward it until Jesus comes back to check in on us and see what we've done with the place. So that's one thing that I found really helpful. I think the other is this, and I'm shamelessly stealing this from Madeleine L'Engle. She, in one of her fiction books, one of her characters describes a theory that she has about life, that you live until you do the things that you were meant to do. And that has been incredibly encouraging to me as I think about all of the reasons that I might say, I'm not ready to go, I'm still hanging on for dear life. It has been encouraging to me to say, the God who put me here has been purposeful in deciding what I will accomplish on this earth before I get called home to glory. And it will not be accidental when that time comes. It may look like an accident from the human side of things. It may be heartbreaking for the people around me. I hope you weep a little bit when I die, but in the best sense. And yet, it will be an indication that the things for which God brought us down to earth have been on earth accomplished, and the further missions that God has for us must be accomplished elsewhere. And I think that can be a hopeful thought, even in the midst of the grief.
Yeah, that's such a great way of looking at it. That reminds me of a passage from a letter from a Baptist missionary named Lottie Moon, who was going to China. Speaking of another single person who spent her life serving the kingdom, but somebody basically asked her, "Are you not afraid of dying? You're going to China." And in the 1800s, leaving America, she's from, I think, Virginia, and going to China was an arduous journey that you may not even survive the journey to get there. And her response was something along the lines of, "I'm firmly convinced that I will be invincible until the time that the Lord calls me home. But there is nothing that I'm going to face that can take me out until it is time for God to say, you need to be taken out." And I thought that was such a beautiful and confidence in the Lord sort of way of looking at it, that it really is, this is a life that we have been given, that we are to steward. And I love that word so much more than other ways that we tend to talk about our lives. But, this is a temporary thing that we have been given. This is a temporary place that we are living. And you use a pretty vivid illustration in your book, talking about a temporary residence that is looking towards a more permanent place, talking about living in the womb and how you have very little memory of the time doing that. It's one of my favorite parts of reading the book, is just imagining tiny little embryonic fetal Greg in the womb, thinking deep thoughts and deciding what sort of large English words he's going to use when he finally emerges. But for those who haven't had the glorious opportunity to read the book yet, which is most people because it comes out tomorrow, right? So plug for,
yeah.
Yes, plug for the release date. If you have not already pre-ordered, please do so. You'll have your opportunity to get that tomorrow. But for those who have not read the book yet, share with us a little bit what you mean when you use that illustration of the time here on Earth being sort of like the time that we spend in the womb.
Yeah, I guess because when you're in the womb, you have very little sense of what could exist outside it, right? You have a very limited understanding of what it means to be in the universe. And so the idea of departing into this other world is, I think, quite terrifying. And yet, seen in retrospect, we can see like, oh no, like that short time that I had in the womb was actually simply meant to prepare me for a much grander world that I would enter into. And so, when I think about the comparison, I think like, well, for one thing, I hope that my early months in heaven are characterized by like a wider variety of beverages than my early months on Earth, and also like a lot less feces.
Right.
But in general, like I think there's a sense in which you leave the womb and you're like, my world has been very small, and suddenly it has become very large. And I think it's fitting to anticipate a similar departure from the womb that has been our time on Earth into the much grander adventure of the things that God has for us. That there's a kind of a purposefulness, both in the preparation of where we have been and in the way that gets us ready for the place that we are headed.
Yeah, I love that. It fits a lot of what Jen talks about in the foreword to the book. There's this paragraph. I want to read it quickly and then kind of get your thoughts on this that goes with that idea of being an insiders club. And when we are in the womb, even if there are multiples of us there, it's still a very small, exclusive kind of group. And one of the positives and negatives of church life can be, it feels like a very small, tight-knit family is the ideal. But when that gets twisted just a little bit, it can often become an us four and no more exclusionary kind of experience for people who naturally feel that they tend to fall towards the margins or the outside of those in groups, which is a lot of us. But this is how Jen says it in the introduction. She says, as Greg Coles so convincingly argues in this book, the gospel's version of belonging is far stranger, far more wonderful, and far more resilient than any insiders club. The wide-armed promises of belonging in the Christian faith center on Jesus, who bore exclusion on the cross in order to tear down every dividing wall between humanity and God, and between every us and them. I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts about that thinking about belonging in general, that really is one of the central messages of the gospel, that those who are outside the veil are brought in, that those who are slaves are adopted as family. How should that look, especially for those of us who tend to feel like we don't fit in? What are some ways that we can really capture that for ourselves in this temporal world that we find ourselves in right now?
Yeah, I think when I think about the way belonging tends to sort of form naturally in the world, there's usually some component of affinity that's involved, right? We belong because we are all mothers with young children. We belong because we are all very interested in macrame. We belong because we have like the Swedish kayakers club. Name your sort of thing, but like we find some kind of affinity, and then that determines that we fit together in some way. And our belonging is at risk whenever some stronger affinity threatens to challenge the affinity we have, which is why, the macrame club falls apart when we realize, like, actually we're more committed to politics, and the political divides in this macrame group are just untenable. Yeah. And so the question of belonging becomes the question of, what are the affinities that hold us so strongly that they can bind us to each other? And I think the among the many beauties of the gospel is the beauty of this idea that the person of Jesus and the gift of Jesus, which is not earned and is in fact totally unearnable, right? It is as unearnable as our life in the womb. It is just a gift that we can only ever receive. That is the most fundamental thing. That is the thing that binds us to one another. And I think that's why the possibility of the promise of Christian belonging is that we are knit together by the pursuit of Jesus, even in spite of all of the things that would threaten to tear us apart. It's so beautiful in theory. It is sometimes so beautiful in practice. Yes. But at the times that it's less beautiful in practice, I wonder if maybe part of the problem is that we have stopped allowing the gift of Jesus itself, that unearned and undeserved thing, we have stopped allowing that to be the strongest affinity interest in the ways that we determine belonging. And we actually decide, you know what, the gift of Jesus is nice and all, but I'm actually more interested in having affinity with people who think more like me politically. Or, you know what, I'm all down with Jesus, but actually fundamentally, I would rather spend my life around people who are of a similar enough socioeconomic status to me that I never feel uncomfortable in the presence of others. I think we find ourselves prioritizing other affinities in place of what ought to be the rightful supreme affinity that binds us together. And so I wonder if maybe one of the opportunities for us as people who follow Jesus and maybe sometimes feel rather out of place in the process. Perhaps we feel like the very Christian communities that are supposed to be our source of belonging do not particularly seem like they are eager to belong with us. Right. I think the opportunity that exists to us in those moments is to say, if we continue clinging to Jesus as our primary affinity, if instead of saying, well, the Christians aren't letting me belong, so screw them, let me see if I can find another group with whom I share some affinity that'll work. If we can actually choose, even in the midst of opposition, choose to cling so tightly to Jesus, I wonder if it is in clinging to Jesus that we will discover other people doing the same thing, and if that will, in fact, then be the thing that binds us together with people with whom we can belong. And certainly, I'll say this as a sort of a pitch for this Revoice platform on which we are currently talking. That has been one of the things that I have loved so much about this Revoice space, is that I find myself gathering together with a bunch of people who I can sincerely say, in a lot of cases, I don't know that we have a ton of other affinities in that, except that we have clung to the person of Jesus, even though we sometimes feel like that hasn't lent itself to a lot of belonging in some other spaces. And yet we choose to come together and say, I'm still after Jesus. And we discover other people who say the same thing. And we're like, holy crap, this community is great. And I think there's intentionality in that beauty. I think that's precisely the kind of joy, the kind of delight in belonging for which Jesus has designed us.
Absolutely. It's what I think back. People ask, what's the big deal about going to conferences where you can come together and have those worship times? What's the big deal? And that idea of being able to shed everything else and say, we are coming together for the purpose of worshiping Jesus. And you can look in a room and go, what in the world? Why are these people all in the same place? Like, they don't look the same. They don't think the same. They don't go to the same kind of church. And you can literally say the only common connection we have is that we desperately cling to Jesus for our worth and our value and our purpose. And we know that he is worthy of all of that worship and all of that praise. And before we started doing Revoice conferences, the closest I had ever been to experiencing that was an opportunity I had one time. I was in New York City for a mission trip. and I made it like this life goal to go to the Brooklyn Tabernacle. My mom is a music person. And so I grew up listening to the Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir. And I was like, I am in New York. I'm going to find out where this place is. And I am going. And we got there on a Sunday morning and walked in, and like the choir wasn't even there. And at first I was like, well, this was a wasted trip to Brooklyn. But I looked around, and there were people literally from every continent of the globe. And we had like a 5-minute just open praise, prayer, and worship time, and standing in the middle of this sanctuary, listening to people speak in every imaginable language. And the only thing literally that we had in common was that we were all talking to Jesus. And I was like, this is just a little bit of what heaven is going to be like. Yeah. And it was that one of those kind of moments that you can kind of cling to, that Ebenezer stone of being able to say, this far the Lord has brought me, like when you look back on kind of those spiritual grasping moments in life, that and opportunities that we've had to worship places like Revoice and things like that, where people have come together and they've put aside all those other misprioritized affinities, which old school churchy language we used to call idolatry. I think I like that misprioritized affinity. We'll have to keep that one in mind when we know that people that are not into Christianese, that would be a much better place to start the conversation, I think, than telling them that their hearts are idol factories. So I like that. But like we have willingly shed those things and been able to say, it doesn't matter about anything else. We're here to spend some time with Jesus. And I mean, that's enough to just, I don't make Presbyterians shout, which I get to make fun of them because like all of my dearest friends are Presbyterians. So.
I was going to say, making Presbyterian shout is the dream.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So that is, it's just this, I mean, I can't misprioritized affinity factories. I like that. We should put that on a t-shirt. We can make it some Revoice swag, just label it misprioritized affinity factory. Like, here's what you are, people. I love that. All right, let me pull up the next quote I wanted to chat with you about. It's on this page. Hold on just one second. All right, you talked a little bit about this in your talk when you chatted about the boys, but I'm going to get some ideas of what some other practical ways may be. But this is something you say in the book. It says, these days, as I watch my close friends pair off in marriage and start having children, I wonder what it means to belong with other people if I never build a family of my own. As I scramble to figure out what city or state or country I'll be living in next year, I wonder what it means to belong in places I can't stay in forever. As I realize what an oddity I am in so many of my groups, an oddity among Christians, an oddity among LGBTQ people, an oddity among academics, an oddity among Americans, I wonder what it means to belong to others, even when I can't manage to blend in with them. And that last sentence is something that really resonated with me as I was reading, that always on a kind of the periphery of all of these groups that I've been a part of my entire life, but have not really been a part of, it feels like more like an observer of these groups right on the edges. I've learned to kind of embrace that tension and that feeling by taking on more of that identity of a sojourner. You know, this is a world that I'm passing through. But how do you really reconcile that feeling of recognizing that we are never going to feel completely at home and completely belong here in this life, and that not overwhelm us? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Like, how do you keep going and basically take the belonging that you can get without causing it just to kind of stop you in your tracks?
Yeah. I think I've often found it helpful, first of all, to recognize that the sense of not quite fitting is shared by a lot more of us than we maybe let on. That a lot of us tend to put off an exterior that says like, oh yes, I'm very much a part of this group, thank you. And yet when we get right down to the heart of it, right? Like there was a time in my life, especially when I was younger, and I was homeschooled, so there's a whole other set of like complexity that comes with that. Right. And I was like, do the public school kids feel different? Like, is it because I'm homeschooled that I'm just having the and it's been striking to me how many people I've since talked to and said, like, you were the sort of person who I thought ought to feel like you belonged. And they would be like, nah, man, like me neither. And I wonder if beginning to recognize, first of all, that this is just kind of the state of the human heart, that despite our attempts to say, like, I want to find kind of the finally finished thing, the place where I say, yes, I've put the last stamp in it, I finally fit here forever and always. I think the fact that we're all searching for that, it reminds me of the famous C.S. Lewis quotation about, the God-shaped vacuum within our hearts. I think there's a sense in which our constant awareness of our lack of belonging, our constant sense that whatever our address is, it is still an impermanent address. I think there's perhaps a bit of a gift there in the reminder that it gives us that we are meant, as you said, to engage with the world in a sojourning kind of way. To say the end game here is not that I would finally reach the place where I belong. The end game is not to plant my flag, get my passport all set and say, like, here, the deed is done, never again shall it change. But the end game is instead to say, maybe there's a gift even in the midst of the movement. It is, in fact, by way of the movement that God intends to use me. And the movement will not ever be finally done, I think, until we get home to glory, because in part, we're programmed to live in a world that no longer exists. Like we're originally programmed for the Garden of Eden, which has since been lost. And so I think there's a kind of homesickness, right? There's a sense in which the souls of ourselves and the soles of our feet are all sort of itching for a soil that we have long since lost, and we'll get back to only in the future. But in the meantime, there is this constant reminder that our invitation is to live in the liminal space in between those two things.
I love that. We've got several questions here. I'm going to, instead of me just going through and finding all my favorite passages of the book and quoting them back to you and then drilling you, we'll give other people some opportunity to ask you some questions, because I could just sit and talk to you about your book for the rest of the night. I sat down this morning and started flipping through it, thinking I was going to spend about 20 minutes just jotting down page numbers so I would know where to go. And I read like the first 108 pages again. And I was like, stop, you have other things to do. So it is well worth your time. If you have watched Greg in any of the Revoice conferences, he is a masterful storyteller, as you got to see a little bit tonight. And that's one of the things that I love so much about this book, is that it is a series of stories tied in with beautiful lessons and observations from scripture and from Greg's own life experience about what it means to belong, what it looks like to be on the outside, what it looks like to not belong, what it looks like and how it feels when you do find those pockets of belonging in this life. So I would encourage you to go ahead and, again, check that out for tomorrow for book release day. I'm super excited about it. So if you follow any of us on social media who have been part of his launch team, be prepared to be inundated tomorrow as well with fun quotes and pretty Instagram shots of our favorite things, because launch days are always my favorite. So looking at a couple of these questions, let's see here on, this is a great one. The first one that's on that, the Q&A screen. This is one that comes up more and more often. It says, last week, a dearly loved family member came out as non-binary, requesting loved ones to use they, them pronouns. There's quite a spectrum from traditional to very open to this, and the family will be discussing soon how to best show love. Some family members have small kids that they are hesitant to teach they, them, and non-binary concepts to. I just found Dr. Cole's pastoral paper on pronoun hospitality, and we'll be sure to read that this week. But do you have any words of wisdom on how to love all involved in this conversation? So that's a great and complicated question. Showing specifically love and hospitality to this family member who has asked to use non-binary they, them pronouns. But how do we also show love to those who are trying to figure out how to respond? How do you help them see that small kids are a little more resilient than we think they are about things like that? It's kind of showing my hand a little bit on how I feel about it. But what do you think, Greg? How can we give some advice on how to show love to everyone involved in this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things that come to mind. One is, and if you're planning to read the paper anyway, which I would recommend to you, though I am admittedly biased on the subject, but I think it's decent. Fundamentally, what I hope you see in the paper is that we can see some thoughtful arguments for why people might be concerned about pronoun use. And yet at the same time, I think what we see when we really dig deeply into the question of what we're engaging with is if we're willing to hear the requests of the trans people and the folks with gender dysphoria who are requesting to use certain pronouns, if we're really willing to understand how that language is operating for them, then we will see that the most Christ-like thing to do with our language, the way to show hospitality with them, is to accommodate them in the way that we speak. And I would say, as somebody whose academic study has been in sort of language itself and what language does in society, I would say if you want to be responsible as a user of language, it's really important to prioritize not so much how you individually think about words, but also to think about the ways words are understood and received by the people you are communicating to, because those are not always the same thing. And often what we see in the tension between a certain breed of Christian conservative who has concerns about accommodating trans people's pronouns, and the trans people who are asking for their pronouns to be used, what we see is these two very different understandings of how the language is working. But to just sit in one camp and say, I refuse to hear what you're saying, I refuse to talk about how these words are working for you, and I'm going to stick with language the way I use it, would be as unhelpful as me heading back over to Indonesia and being like, I'm sticking with English because dang nabbit, I met Jesus in English and you will too. Right. Like we need to have the spiritual sensitivity. We need to have the cross-cultural sensitivity to be able to say, how is language working for the people to whom I want to communicate the love of Jesus? And then say, how can I speak as honestly as possible about the goodness of God, about the deep, deep love that Jesus has for all of us, about the incredible wide-armed reach of the gospel? How can I communicate those things honestly and truly in a language that the people to whom I am trying to speak will be able to understand it?
Yes.
And so I think when we enter the conversation with that posture, I think we become able to see that using the pronouns that trans people prefer and encouraging others to do the same is in fact a way of extending that Christ-like love by way of contextual linguistic awareness.
Yes, I love that. I had a conversation earlier this week with Bill Henson talking about missiology and the LGBTQ community. And that was a great point that he brought up as well, that when we begin to see the LGBT community as a cross-cultural experience, it opens up, especially for those of us who live and have grown up in very conservative evangelical circles, it helps us understand more why we need to be so accommodating and hospitable in how we talk, that we wouldn't go to a foreign country and insist that the people speak English before we told them about Jesus. And it's the same kind of thing, that if you are going to go into another culture, you need to humbly adopt that culture's principles, language, word usage to show the fact that you're not sitting on some sort of spiritual high horse, expecting them to conform to you. That if Jesus condescends from heaven to earth to make himself known to us, surely we can change our posture and our position to be able to be as accommodating and hospitable and loving to anyone. And that can be cross-generational. There are a lot of times I feel like I'm speaking a completely different language from my parents, that if you think about it in those types of frames, that we have to constantly adjust our perspective and adjust our language based on who we're talking to. Don't take this one instance as the time to draw some line in the sand linguistically, that you're not going to fall down a slippery slope of liberalism because you are accommodating someone in their pronoun usage. It is important, but it is not going to devastate your relationship with Jesus. But hard-heartedly holding to your opinion of things very well could. Somebody has asked where we can find a said paper that Dr. Coles has written. Is it on your website?
It is. The best place to find it is to go to the centerforfaith.com. It's on their website under the pastoral papers section. I believe Excellent. It is the 11th paper at that link. If you can't find it, just shoot me an email, contact@gregcoles.com. Shoot me an email and be like, yo, where's that paper at? Or I can give the link to Becca. Oh, wait, actually, I think I can put the link in here. I will put the link in the chat to all the peeps before this is over. Yeah,
that is my solemn so technologically savvy. We will instantaneously provide the links for you. So there you go. I love it.
Okay, that link is now in the chat. Paper number Beautiful. 11 is the one which you seek.
All right. This is a great question. For those of us who are on the autism spectrum and or with other mental health conditions that make it easier to be celibate, what advice or thoughts do you have about the idea of belonging? So some of us, we struggle with the idea of belonging because we think we're never going to be in a marriage, so we're always going to be on the outside. And for some people, that's just not really the issue.
Sure.
They don't naturally fall into that category.
I think, a couple things strike me as I think about that, and all of these I will offer as somebody who, I know a little bit about autism. I have tried to learn some, insofar as I can to love my friends with autism, but I won't speak as anybody with like definitive knowledge on the subject here. But the first thing that comes to mind is the ways in which I would always want to say often, and I feel like my experience of sexual orientation is a thing where I have known some people around me who will say like, oh, that sounds like a really sad and hard thing. And like, it would have been nice if you didn't have to have that as part of your experience and you could have just been straight. And there was a time when I sort of nodded along with them and was like, I see what you're saying. It would have been better if I was straight. And now increasingly, for reasons we could talk about it if we wanted to, but I have increasingly come to say like, what if instead I said, we all have different stories that the Lord sovereignly allows us to have, and those stories are tricky in different ways. And yet I think my particular story offers a particular kind of gift. That when I lean into the particular kind of gifting that God has given, there's something good. There's something worth claiming and clinging to. And I think similarly, again, not meaning to make any false equivalencies here, because metaphors and analogies are always sort of specious activities. And yet, I wonder if there's a somewhat similar dynamic where sometimes neurotypical folks like myself might have a tendency to sometimes look at the community with autism and say like, oh, like this is sad in the following ways, and wouldn't it just be nicer if the whole world were neurotypical? And yet I think there's a great value in saying, no, au contraire, like the Lord has sovereignly allowed people who dearly love him to have this particular experience of the world. And there is a special kind of gift in that.
Yeah.
And I know for myself, at least, when I would think about celibacy, which celibacy too, when I first came to the conclusion that I was going to be celibate, I was like, and this is one of the many things that's like sort of a second best. Like I would have gotten married if I could have managed to fall in love with a woman, but that's not going to happen. So here we are being celibate, which I guess is fine. It's okay. Right. Like that mentality towards celibacy was not particularly conducive to sort of leaning into the depth of the goodness of the belonging that God wanted to give me within that vocation. But the more I began to claim it and to say, I don't think this is God's second best. I think this is God's first best. And God came up with a very clever megaphone with which to communicate to me, like, here shall be your vocation, Coles. Marriage shall not be your vocation, even though you would be tempted to think so. When I see the sovereign hand of God nudging me in this direction, and I start to lean into the particular kinds of purposes that I have, I think the opportunity to live on purpose creates for our hearts a really beautiful sense of belonging. That the more we feel like this is a place that God has purposely placed me, there are things that God has purposely called me to do. There are people who God has purposely placed in my life. There are people to whom God intends for me to reach out. That I have been given a particular kind of calling. I think the more we see our particular vocation in all its distinctiveness and can honestly say, I am willing and eager, and I am beginning to see the way the hand of God has been at work in informing and shaping and directing me on this path. I think the better situated we are to find belonging in the midst of that.
Amen. I love that. That's I've really enjoyed the conversation that's been going on inside the world the last couple of years, looking at that specific point of being thankful for our particular orientations and attractions, because LGBTQ people in the church have unique perspectives to be able to contribute to the body. That it's not oh, it's a shame that that's how you are. Look at this result of the fallen world, blah, blah, blah. It makes it sound as if God was a very boring, everything was typical, like we would all look the same, think the same, act the same, had it not been for the fall. Like diversity is somehow a result of the fall, right? And that was really kind of my misplaced thinking before we started having this conversation of that, we really would have been very boring, which is so sad. And so like looking at that idea now of if we can acknowledge the fact that our diversity is not an inherent result of the fall, but that people are neurodiverse, people are racially diverse, we are culturally diverse, we are all of these ways of being diverse because we have an infinitely diverse God who created us in a way that every single person has this unique perspective on who God is in relation to who we are as individuals. That really does mean that every single member of the body of Christ has a unique contribution to the body of Christ. And it always used to feel like such a cop-out in church, like when the worship pastor would get up there and say, if you aren't here in the body, we are missing out on what it is you have to contribute to the family of God. And I'd think, oh, yeah, buddy, if I'm not here to do X, Y, and Z, if I'm not here to serve in the nursery, somebody else is going to come serve in the nursery. Like we're all just replaceable and, interchangeable parts. Like we're, some sort of just line on at a factory, but God doesn't describe us as the line in the factory putting together and producing disciples. We are a body. We're not a factory line, that we're not interchangeable parts, that we are unique individuals. And just remembering that has helped me feel much more at home no matter where I might find myself, as
Mhm.
opposed to thinking I need to fit in. I'm not ever going to fit in. I'm weird, and
We love your weird, Becca.
Exactly, right? But instead of seeing that as a problem, really working on my own heart and soul of being able to say, I hope I don't fit in, because that means I have nothing extra to contribute to this, whatever particular conversation. Ruth Graham, Billy Graham's wife, is very famous for saying, if we both think the same things in a relationship, one of us is irrelevant, and I think that goes along with the church as well, that you need to know and be able to rest confidently in the fact that you have something unique to contribute to the church. And if we can all see that, regardless of whatever our specific diversity might be, being able to humbly say, I have something to contribute to this body that nobody else on the planet can. And it's because of my relationship with Christ, not because I'm so, somehow inherently special. Everybody's special. I'm a child of the 80s, so I got that from Sesame Street. Everyone is unique and special, just like everyone else. But it really is true, right? So, that's a great way of looking at that, whether it's neurodiversity or any other type of diversity, that it's not a specific type of relationship that you're looking to get into, but it's the fact that we just need to be in relationship within the body of Christ in general.
Yeah. And in the context, I would hasten to add too, when we're talking specifically about sexuality and the etiology of sexuality and did God make you gay? I would hasten to say that all of our experiences of post-lapsarian sexuality, everybody after the fall is experiencing a fallen sexuality in some way.
Exactly.
So it's not that we're blaming God as if God is the one who is the author of all of our sexual temptations that we're called to say no to.
Right.
And yet there is a sense of purposefulness that I think believing in the purposefulness of God, even as we negotiate our experience of the world, has a certain beauty to it.
Yeah. Excellent. This next question says, I've been withdrawn for decades from getting close to most guys because I've been worried it would become temptation. Any advice on how to balance those fleeing temptations and sins with stepping out into potentially risky situations? That's a great question that most people have had to deal with at some point in time. What do you think about that?
My own experience of that has been, there have definitely been some times in my life where I was like, I gotta withdraw from relationship. If I get too close to men, then I'll, fall in love with all of them. And so it's just best for everyone if I don't. And what I discovered after some years of having that be sort of my primary approach to dealing with temptation, I discovered that actually withdrawing was also not a foolproof way of guarding myself against temptation. Because number one, at least for me personally, that relational isolation actually fed into some of the unhealthy practices that I had. So things like lust, to the degree that I was tempted by pornography, it was much more when I felt very isolated from others. And so isolation, even though it can feel like the safe option, is not in fact the safe option. I think the thing that truly saves us from temptation is pursuit of the person of Jesus. And pursuit of the person of Jesus is not really a safe endeavor. It's a wildly risky endeavor, and it's a wildly risky endeavor that involves pitfalls on both sides. But I think when we do pursue relationship in wise and healthy ways, again, needing to guard against both the danger of isolation and the danger of becoming sort of unhealthfully attached. I know that a couple of things I've found helpful are to figure out which forms of relational and emotional connection and intimacy are actually helpful and feeding my soul, and which ones are just sort of feeding my flesh, the things that I want. So like when people will say like, oh, don't you just want to cuddle with another man? I'll be like, well, like, sure, I'd love to. But like for me, like, I think the boundaries that we need to draw from person to person may differ somewhat. For me, doing a whole ton of cuddling with other men is not going to lead my soul in constructive directions. I'm gonna just be honest with you. And it turns out that even though there's a part of me that really feels like, boy, that sounds like fun, there's also a part of me that recognizes like that's not the actual feeding that my soul needs. And so I think to try to make some of these distinctions between like, what are the things that are actually going to contribute to my emotional and spiritual health, and what are the things that I just feel like I want? In the words of Paul, all things are permissible to me, but not all of them are constructive. I've also found it really helpful to try to find opportunities for relational connection that are not only exclusively one-on-one. I think one-on-one connection is great. But for instance, I have found that I actually really love connecting with married couples. Married couples are just so much fun. And don't get me wrong, some married couples less fun. But like a good married couple, like the kind of married couple you really wanted to get married in the first place, there can be something so beautiful about engaging in that kind of relationship because, there's a particular perspective that they can bring. And also, when I enter into the context of their relationship with one another, it's a lot harder for me to sort of roll that out in the way that my mind might want to fantasize about it if I were to head in an unhealthy direction. Whereas the relational depth that I can get both from both partners in that relationship, if you're only ever having relational depth and relational intimacy with people of the sex that you're attracted to, then you're missing out on a good half of the population.
That's right.
Like seriously, there are so many good people in the world. So I think maybe like there are certain conversations vis-a-vis my spiritual life that I actually find it more helpful to have with women than I do with men. And there are other conversations I have tended to find it more helpful to have with men. And there are some conversations that I save for just my non-binary friends. And there's a whole lot of Jesus going on in a whole lot of people. And I think to the degree we seek that out from more folks, we will be better off as a result of it.
Yeah, I love that. That was I think one of the most perspective altering statements someone ever made to me was one of my counselors when I was really starting to kind of sort through what in the world am I supposed to do with the fact that I love Jesus and I like girls. It was one of those cycles of, okay, there's this girl that we've been friends for years, and now all of a sudden I kind of feel like I want more and I'm freaking out and I don't want to talk to her. And I said something about, I just don't know how to stop being attracted to my friends. And very calmly, she said, why would you want to stop being attracted to your friends? Otherwise, you're just going to hang out with people you don't really like. And I was like, that makes so much sense. She was like, of course you are attracted or drawn to your friends. That is the foundation of friendship, is that affinity or some sort of connection. And I had always looked at it as, if I am at all feeling drawn or connected to a person, then that must be a sexual attraction and I have to cut that off. And so I ended up having like no friends. And really taking the time to parse out, why am I attracted to this person? How am I attracted to this person? And if you begin to see that it's some sort of self-fulfilling or lustful attraction, there are lots of ways to deal with that, as far as confession and repentance, having somebody hold you accountable. Maybe you do need to step back from that relationship for a while. But a lot of times what I want to tell people is, don't necessarily be afraid of the fact that you feel attraction to your friends. That's normal and healthy and good that you are drawn to spend time with somebody that makes your life better. So really kind of take the time to stop and think about what it is that's going on with that. And definitely yes to hanging out with married couples. It used to be that when I would hang out with married couples, especially if it was large groups, that they naturally all end up at some point in the night falling away into gender specific groups, and the girls would all go to the kitchen and the boys would start watching a ball game or whatever it was. And I'd find myself just like wandering back and forth. Like I'd end up in the room watching the football game with the guys, feeling very comfortable there, and then thinking I really should go back with the girls because I'm a girl, and then would like go back and talk with the women. And that's another one of those unique places that often we can find ourselves, is being able to help straight people understand how to interact with people that they could possibly be attracted to or deal with. How do I have brotherly friendships with men? How do I have sisterly friendships with women? It ends up being an interesting way to look at it. So yeah, a lot of things to think about there. This is a great one. Love talking about gender. If you imagine your gender as a color, what color would it be? Greg, what color is your gender?
Can I say like blue-gray just because it's my favorite color?
Cornflower? Periwinkle. Blue-gray.
Maybe a little like just a little less vibrant than periwinkle.
I like it.
Yeah.
That's a good one. Yeah, I would lean somewhere kind of in that purpley sort of bluish spectrum somewhere as well. Just because now I feel a little at home kind of wherever I am. I don't feel out of place with the women. I don't feel out of place with the men. I am what I am. I think purple would be not like deep royal purple though, like some sort of subtle, maybe purple gray. I like that, adding the gray in to kind of tone it down a little bit. I like that.
You're a person of subtlety, I think, Becca.
Yeah, definitely. I want to keep people on their toes, kind of keep them guessing. So, absolutely. That was a great, I love questions like that. I'm so bad about coming up with questions like that, but I have a couple of friends that are like spot on with like the cocktail hour cool questions, icebreaker kind of questions like that. And I love them. They're so much fun. Let's see. Anybody else have any questions that they'd like to? We're all sharing our colors. All right. I love it. I didn't have the chat thing open. Purple, gray, good stuff. Salmon. Ooh, that's a good one. Oh, your blue-gray is the color of your shirt. Look at you.
Oh, well, I planned that nicely.
I know. When I looked at the question, the first thing I wanted to do was immediately seeing yellow as the color of her energy. And I thought that's definitely going to age me because that's very much like a 90s kind of grunge rock sort of song. But I don't know. All right. It looks like we are wrapping up right on time. Ooh, are you going to come back to the kid question? Oh, I missed it. Oh, with trans language and the kids. Oh, that is a great one. I didn't really fully answer that one. How do you handle that trans language conversation with small kids? Have you had to have that conversation or had parents ask you how you would handle that conversation with younger kids yet?
Had parents ask me, yes. I sometimes say that I am categorically sworn off giving child rearing advice, though then usually if people prod me long enough, I'll be like, actually, it turns out that I have loads of child rearing advice and I was just waiting for you to ask. So I will not speak with definitive confidence about how children ought to be reared. I will, however, say this much, that children have, I think, more capacity for understanding than we often give them credit for. Yeah. And that is thought number one. And thought number two is that I would rather, if I were to have children and to be in charge of what things I wanted to be the number one priorities in how I trained up my children, I would hope that one of the number one priorities I had for training up my children was to help them be eager to speak in a way that communicated the open-armed love of Jesus for everyone. And I would want that, of course, to be paired with appropriate forms of theological understanding that were age appropriate. Insofar as that seemed to impinge on certain conversations. In the case of the question of pronouns for trans people, I am of the opinion that when we do the theological deep dive, we conclude actually the thing we should all be invited into theologically is to use the pronouns that people ask us to use. And so I would want to teach my children that as soon as I wanted to teach myself and everybody else that, because it seems like a great way to love others. And I hope that I would have raised kids who love others well. And so when I get to give parenting advice, I want to tell parents, raise your kids to love others well.
Absolutely. That's a conversation I'll be having shortly with my kids, I'm sure. So yeah, it's good to think and to pray through those sorts of things, that it's when the question has come up, especially with my 6-year-old, because if he thinks it comes out of his mouth, that he asks often, is that person a boy or a girl? That it's automatically just that binary, because that's where his mind is. That's what he knows. And so beginning to have those conversations of, well, not everybody feels like they are a boy or a girl. Not everyone recognizes themselves in that way. How do you think we should refer to somebody if they say they don't really feel like a boy or a girl? And his response was, maybe we ask them. And I thought, look at that. The 6-year-old gets it. I was like, yes, buddy, that's a great way of saying it. If you aren't sure, you should just ask somebody and ask them kindly, not are you a boy or a girl, but just say, how do you see yourself? Or what would you like me to call you? And that's something that you can ask anybody, from name to pronouns. What would you like me to call you is a great place to start. And my 6 and 7-year-old get that.
And I think if there are folks who are listening who feel concerned about that question because of things that you believe about gender identity ethics, about what you think is appropriate for followers of Jesus to do as they steward their sense of gender identity.
Right.
I would just say, I think it's really valuable for us to recognize that we can have an understanding of what we believe is the best thing for followers of Jesus to do as they steward their gender identities. But it's helpful to distinguish that understanding from our understanding of what does it look like to love people, regardless of whether they don't follow Jesus or perhaps they follow Jesus but don't share our convictions about gender identity ethics. We still have to answer the question of what does it look like to love those people well in the ways that we use language and speak to and about them. And so this is not so much us weighing in on like, here's the definitive answer you must land on vis-a-vis gender identity ethics. This is us saying, here is what we understand to be the most helpful way of using language in a way that honors others.
Exactly. And that goes beyond ethics. That's hospitality and honoring the inherent image of God in the people around us. So yeah, I appreciate that. Definitely, Greg. Y'all, thank you so much for joining us. We are a few minutes over, so we want to let y'all go so that we are honoring and respecting your time as well. Somebody did ask, is this going to be available later for those who were not able to join us? And it will be. We're going to do a little bit of editing and cleaning up on it, and it will be made available on our YouTube channel, hopefully by the end of this week, if not the beginning of next week. So thank y'all so much for joining us. Greg, thank you for joining us. If you want to know more about Greg, he has his own website. It is gregcoles.com. It's Greg, right? Not Gregory on the website.
You can actually go to either one. They go to the same place.
Beautiful. You buy them and they take you to the same place. Excellent. So gregcoles.com. You can learn all you want to know about Greg. Check out his book tomorrow for launch day. And we are so glad that all of you came to this deep dive with Revoice. We will check y'all again next month. Be on the lookout for our next date and time for our March deep dive. Y'all have a great evening.